My name is Bran Calder, and for 11 years I ran the quartermaster's yard at Harrow's Stake, a garrison post bolted onto the edge of a border world nobody important cared about, until the year somebody did. I want to tell this plainly because the way it got told afterward in bulletins, in the half-true broadsheets that came through on the supply runs, in the version the compact finally put its seal on, made it sound like a fairy story. A lost princess. A human who turned her into a blade. None of that is what happened in my yard. What happened in my yard took 100 days, and it was slower and stranger and harder than any of that. And I was there for every one of them, so I'm the one who gets to say what it actually was. Harrow's Stake wasn't much to look at, even before any of this. A walled compound built around a supply depot, a watchtower that had been a grain silo before the border tensions made it useful for something else, a handful of outbuildings, a kitchen garden Senna kept stubbornly alive against soil that didn't want to give us much. We sat at the edge of contested ground, close enough to the trade lanes to matter for resupply, far enough from anything important that nobody ever expected trouble to find us specifically. I'd built a quiet life there after my wife died, the kind of life a man builds when he stopped expecting much from the world beyond the next day's work done honestly. I checked the fence every morning. I kept the ledgers straight. I didn't ask the supply skiffs too many questions about what else they carried, because asking questions on a border post is a quick way to make enemies of people you'll need again. It started with a man named Joss, dying on my porch steps at first light, with a child wrapped under his coat like contraband. He'd come in on the late supply skiff, the kind of vessel that runs cargo nobody asks too many questions about, and by the time he reached my door he'd already taken 2 rounds low in the side and was holding himself together through nothing but will. I knew him a little smuggler, sometimes courier, the sort of man who skirted every border check on this side of the territory and somehow always landed clean. He didn't land clean this time. "Calder," he said, and his voice had that flat, careful sound men get when they're rationing their breath. "I need you to take her." The coat moved. A small hand came out first, fingers long and thin, the skin underneath them a pale violet gray, like dusk on water. Then a face, narrow, large dark eyes, the pointed ears of the Vire houses, the high-born lines of that world up near the reach where the noble families still ran half the trade lanes by blood right. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 by human counting, though their years run different. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound at all. She just looked at me the way you look at a door, you don't know what's behind. "Whose is she?" I said, because I needed to know what I was being handed. "Doesn't matter whose," Ware said. "Matters who she's running from." He coughed, and it cost him. "House Tessely's cousins decided the succession's cleaner without her in it. Her own guard's dead. I'm what's left of the getting her out plan, and I'm not going to finish it." He pushed her toward me, hard enough that I had to catch her or let her fall. 100 days, he said. That's what her mother's people need to regroup and come for her clean with enough force that nobody tries this twice. 100 days, Calder. Can you keep a child alive 100 days? I didn't answer fast enough for him. "You're the only honest man on this stretch of border who isn't already bought by somebody," he said, and there was something almost like an apology in it, like he knew what he was asking and was sorry for the asking anyway. "That's worth more right now than a man with soldiers. Soldiers can be bought too. Honest is harder to buy." He was already going gray at the mouth. I'd seen enough wounds in my time to know the kind of math his body was doing, and the answer to that math wasn't in his favor. "She's not house-trained," he said, which I understood later was his cracked attempt at a joke, the kind dying men sometimes reach for because the alternative is screaming. "Doesn't talk much, doesn't trust easy. Watched her own guard go down defending a doorway 3 weeks back and didn't make a sound the whole time, not one, just watched and remembered the angle the blade came in at. Told me about it 2 days later, flat as a ledger entry. Good instincts, though. Watch her instincts. They're better than yours, better than mine ever were, and I made my living off mine." How do I keep a child like that alive, I said, if I don't know the first thing about who's hunting her? You don't need to know who. You need to know what they want, and what they want is quiet. A clean disappearance, no incident, nothing the compact has to investigate. That's your whole advantage. Don't give them quiet. Make every day she's in your care a day somebody has to account for. He managed something that might have been the ghost of the smuggler's grin he must have had once before all this. You run supply manifests for a living, Calder. You already know how to make a thing disappear into paperwork that nobody bothers reading twice. Do the opposite for once in your life. Make her impossible to misplace quietly. Then he told me her name, not her title, just her name, which I'll keep to myself even now, because a name like that painted on a screen is how hunters find what they're hunting. And then Joss Ware stopped talking altogether, and I buried him myself behind the equipment shed because there wasn't time to do it any more properly than that. And I had a child standing in my doorway who hadn't moved an inch through any of it. I'd run that garrison yard alone since my wife died of fever 3 winters back. No children of my own that lived past infancy. That's its own grief, and not one I'll spend on this telling. I was 51 years old, built like a man who'd spent 3 decades hauling crates and drilling recruits, and I had exactly no idea what a person does with a small, silent, hunted alien girl who wouldn't speak above a whisper and flinched if you moved your hand too fast near her face. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I gave her a job. Not because I was clever about it, because the yard ran on work, and work was the only language I had that didn't require her to trust me first. You'll sleep in the storeroom off the kitchen, I told her that first morning, keeping my voice level and my hands visible, the way you talk to a spooked animal, because grief does that to you whether the grieving thing has 2 legs or 4. You'll eat what we eat. And you'll learn the yard, because 100 days is a long time to sit still and be afraid. She didn't answer, but she followed me when I walked the perimeter that morning, 3 steps behind, watching everything, the gate mechanism, the angle of the watchtower, the gap in the eastern fence line I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and never had. By the second lap she'd found the gap before I pointed at it. Ware was right. Her instincts were better than mine. I want to be honest about what those 100 days were, because I think people imagine I was forging some kind of weapon, drilling a child in the arts of war the way you'd sharpen a knife. That's not it. I'm a quartermaster, not an executioner. What I taught her was the only thing I actually knew how to teach: how a body survives, how you read a room before you walk into it, how you ration food, water, sleep, fear, how you carry weight without breaking under it, first literal weight, crates and water barrels scaled down to what her frame could manage, and then the other kind. The first 2 weeks she barely spoke. She'd watch me work, and then, an hour later, I'd find some small task finished that I hadn't asked her to do, the tools sorted by size, the chickens fed, a torn seam on my work coat mended in stitches so small and careful they looked machine-made. She was telling me things in the only safe language she had left. I am useful. Do not send me away. I never once considered sending her away. I want that on the record, because there's a version of this story where the gruff old soldier resists the child for half the runtime before his heart cracks open. That's not what happened. Joss Ware died on my steps asking me to keep a child alive for 100 days, and the moment I picked her up off that porch, the decision was already made. Everything after that was just the doing of it. There was a morning, somewhere in that second week, that I've never managed to put fully into words, though I've tried more than once over the years since. I'd gone down to the kitchen before dawn, same as always, and found her already awake, sitting very still at the table with her hands folded in front of her, watching the door the way you'd watch a door you weren't sure was going to open on something good. I didn't say anything. I just set a plate of bread and the last of the preserved fruit in front of her and crouched down to her level, the way you would for any frightened thing, human or otherwise, and held out my hand, open, palm up, offering nothing more than the gesture itself. She looked at the hand a long moment. Then she looked at my face, checking it the way I'd come to understand she checked everything, and then slowly she reached out and put 2 fingers against my palm, just barely touching, the lightest contact a person can make and still call it contact at all. It wasn't trust yet. I want to be honest about that. It was the very first inch of trust, tested carefully, ready to be withdrawn at the first wrong sign. But it was something, and in a yard that had been quiet and empty and grieving for 3 winters before she arrived, something was more than I'd had in a long while. By the 3rd week she'd started talking, in short, careful sentences, like she was testing whether words still worked the way they used to before whatever happened to her guard happened. "Why do you check the fence every morning?" she asked once, watching me walk the line. "Because the day I stop is the day something gets through it," I said. She thought about that for a long moment. "That's a stupid way to live," she said, "always waiting for the bad thing." "It's not waiting," I told her. "It's just being the kind of person the bad thing has to work to get past." She didn't say anything else that day, but the next morning she was up before me, walking the fence line on her own, checking it with the same flat, careful attention I'd been giving it for 11 years. I watched her from the kitchen window and didn't say a word, because some lessons land better when you let the child think she found them herself. The 4th week she started asking why about everything, the way children do once they decide the world is worth understanding rather than just surviving. Why did the watchtower face east instead of north, when the road came in from the east but the worse weather always came from the north? Why did I keep the grain stores split between 2 buildings instead of one, when one would be easier to guard? Why did Senna salt the meat heavier in the warm months than the cold ones, when it seemed backward to her? I answered every one I could answer honestly, and told her flat out when I didn't know, because Ware had asked me to keep her alive, not to pretend at wisdom I didn't have. She seemed to trust the honest not knowing more than she'd have trusted a confident lie. By the 5th week she'd taken to following Senna Pike around the kitchen in the mornings, learning the small economies of running a household on a contested border, how to make a week's flour stretch to 10 days if the supply skiff ran late, how to read which vegetables in the root cellar needed eating first by the give of the skin under your thumb. Senna told me once quietly, while the girl was out at the well, that she'd never seen a child watch so hard, like watching itself was a kind of armor. "She's not learning to cook, Bran," Senna said. "She's learning that a household can run smooth even when the world outside it isn't." That's a different lesson, and it's the one she needed. I started taking her on the supply runs into the nearest way station town after that, partly because Ware's instinct about quiet had stuck with me. A child glimpsed openly, riding beside a known quartermaster on a known route, was a harder thing to disappear than a child hidden in a back room nobody admitted existed. She didn't like the town at first. Too many strangers, too many unreadable faces. I taught her what I'd taught new recruits for years. Pick one detail per stranger and hold on to it. The angle of a coat, the wear on a boot heel, anything specific enough to remember them by if you needed to later. Within a month she could walk through that way station's single crowded market and give me, afterward, a more complete accounting of who'd been there and how they'd carried themselves than I could have managed myself. There were harder days too, days I don't tell easily even now. Around the 6th week she broke a clay jug while helping Senna in the kitchen, an ordinary accident, the kind any child has a dozen times over, and the look that crossed her face before the pieces had even finished settling on the floor wasn't a child's look at all. It was the look of something braced for a blow that didn't come. Senna just sighed and reached for the broom and said something about the jug being older than both of them combined in good riddance, and the girl stood very still for a long moment, watching, recalibrating, learning in real time that this household didn't run on the rules the one she'd come from must have run on. I didn't say anything about it to her directly. Some lessons are better learned by watching them not happen the way you expected. By week 8, she'd started teaching herself the small mechanical things around the yard. How the well pump seal needed repacking every season, how to read the pressure gauge on the water cistern, how to splice a frayed line rather than simply replace it. I hadn't asked her to learn any of it. I came out to the equipment shed one evening to find her with her sleeves rolled and grease on her hands, finishing a repair on the pump seal that I'd been putting off for a week. And when I asked her how she'd known how to do it, she just said she'd watched me do the last one and it hadn't looked complicated. And the look on her face when she said it was the first thing I'd have called pride, plain and unguarded, since the night she came to my door. The household noticed her changing before I let myself admit I'd been the one changing too. My cook, an older widow named Senna Pike who'd run my kitchen since before my wife passed, started setting a third plate without being told. The two hands I kept on for the heavier yard work, Tully and a quiet boy named Ames, started including her in their card games in the evening, not because I asked them to, but because she'd started sitting close enough to watch, and you can't watch a card game that long without somebody dealing you in. By day 30 she was beating Tully more often than not, which she never let him forget, in the dry, economical way she'd started using for jokes, 3 words, perfectly aimed, gone before you could decide whether to laugh. It was during those card games I started learning the small ways she was genuinely alien, not just a quiet child wearing an unusual face. The Vire don't sleep the way we do, not in one long stretch but in several shorter ones across a day, and the first weeks I'd assumed her wakefulness at odd hours was the silent nightmares I've already mentioned, before I understood it was simply how her people's bodies were built to rest. She read color differently too. She could pick out a marked card from across a dim room by some shift in the die I couldn't see at all, which made her murderously good at games that depended on visual tells, and which also meant, more usefully, that she could read the wear pattern on a stranger's boots or the fade on a coat seam from twice the distance I could. Her people grieved differently as well. I came to learn not through tears, which her physiology didn't produce in the human way, but through a kind of stillness, a controlled withdrawal of motion that to human eyes could look like nothing at all, and which I'd been misreading as flatness or shock for longer than I'm proud to admit, before Senna, of all people, gently set me right one evening, having apparently understood it herself through nothing but careful watching and a grandmother's patience. Tully took to her fastest of anyone in the household besides Senna and me, in his blunt, uncomplicated way. He was 22, built like a man who'd spent his whole short life hauling crates, and about as subtle as a dropped anvil, which I think she found restful after whatever careful, watchful court life she'd come from. He taught her every card game he knew within the first month, and she beat him at most of them within the second, and their running, good-natured argument about whether she cheated or simply paid better attention became one of the steady sounds of the household, the kind of background noise you don't notice you've come to depend on until a night goes by without it. I'm not going to pretend it was all gentle. There were nights she woke up making no sound at all, which was worse than if she'd screamed, because a child who's learned to be hunted in total silence has learned something no child should have to learn. I'd sit outside the storeroom door on those nights, not going in unless she asked, because some kinds of comfort have to be requested or they're just another kind of intrusion. Sometimes she did ask. Sometimes she just needed to know somebody was on the other side of the door, awake, between her and whatever the dark held. Around day 40, the first riders came through. They called themselves trade inspectors, 3 of them, Vire by the cut of their coats and the long, careful vowels of court speech, asking after manifest irregularities on a route that ran nowhere near my garrison. I'd run enough quartermaster ledgers to know a cover story when one was standing in my yard drinking my water. Their leader was a narrow, soft-spoken man with the kind of unhurried courtesy that always makes me more cautious, not less, because real urgency tends to show its edges, and his didn't show any at all. He asked about cargo manifests for a full quarter-hour before he ever mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard rumor of a refugee child moving through this stretch of border, displaced from the recent unrest up in the Reach, possibly traveling with false papers. He watched my face very carefully when he said it. I gave him nothing, no manifest discrepancies, no unaccounted cargo, no children who didn't belong to the household. I'd had her scrubbing pots in the kitchen the moment I saw the dust trail on the eastern road, drilled into that exact response over the prior week without either of us naming why. And Senna Pike, bless her, had the good sense to put a kitchen apron and a sour expression on the girl and tell the inspectors, when one of them wandered close enough to the kitchen door to look in, that she was a ward taken in off a relief transport 2 years back, mute since the crossing, more trouble than she was worth. And would they kindly let an old woman get on with the evening meal? The girl herself never looked up from the pot she was scrubbing, not once, though I knew she'd catalogued every one of their faces and the make of their sidearms before they'd finished dismounting. They left unsatisfied. They'd be back. I knew it the way you know weather coming, not from any one sign, but from the whole feel of the air changing. That night, after the household had gone quiet, she came and found me in the equipment shed, where I was running a whetstone over the edge of a tool I had no honest use sharpening that sharp. "They'll come back," she said, not a question. "Probably. With more of them next time." "Probably that too." She sat down on an overturned crate, watching my hands work the stone. "Joss told me 100 days," she said. It was the first time she'd said his name since the porch. He said it like it was a wall, like after 100 days I'd be safe. "He was buying time for the people coming for you," I said. "Not building you a wall." "I know that." Her voice had gone flat in a way I'd come to recognize as the sound she made right before something true came out of her. I used to think being safe meant somebody bigger standing between me and the bad thing. My guard, my mother's soldiers, you. She looked at the blade in my hands, not the stone, the blade itself, the actual edge of it. "I don't think that anymore." "What do you think now?" "I think being safe is knowing what to do when nobody's standing between you and it." She said it the way you'd report a fact you checked twice and found still true. "Teach me that." Not, she gestured vaguely at the blade, dismissing it. "Not killing things. I don't want to be a weapon. I want to be the kind of person the bad thing has to work to get past." She'd given my own words back to me, 6 weeks later, fully understood in a way I hadn't fully understood them myself when I first said them. I sat with that a long moment before I answered her. "All right," I said, "then that's what we'll do." So the second half of her 100 days looked different from the first. Less hauling crates, more of the harder work, reading the angle a stranger's shoulders make when they're deciding whether to lie to you, the specific quiet that falls over a room half a second before something goes wrong, how to move through a space so you're never standing where a hand could close on you easy. I taught her the things 30 years of running a contested border post had taught me, distilled down to whatever a child that size and that age could actually carry. Not soldiering, surviving with your eyes open the whole way through. She took to it the way some children take to music, not effortlessly, but with a hunger underneath the effort, like she'd been waiting her whole short life for somebody to finally tell her the rules of the game she'd already been forced to play. By day 70, she could read Tully's tells at cards better than I could. By day 80, she'd started correcting my fence line route, finding 2 more weak points I'd missed in 11 years of walking at half asleep. There's one day from that stretch I think about more than the others, day 61 by my own count, kept in the ledger I'd started keeping without telling anyone why, marking off the 100 like a man counting down a sentence he'd chosen for himself. We were out past the south paddock, running the same drill we'd run a dozen times before, me playing the stranger approaching at the gate, her practicing reading whether my intent was honest before I'd said a word, when she stopped mid-exercise and asked me, flat out, whether I thought her mother was still alive. I hadn't expected the question, and I didn't lie to her, because I'd promised myself early on that whatever else I got wrong with this child, I wouldn't get that wrong. I don't know, I told her. Where didn't say, and I haven't had word either way. She nodded like she'd expected that answer and had simply needed to hear it said plainly rather than softened. Everyone keeps almost telling me she's fine, she said. Senna does it, Tully does it. You don't, and that's why I trust you more than I trust them, even though I know they mean it kindly. She looked off toward the tree line, the same ridge that would, in another 35 days, hide us both from 11 riders. I think I knew, the night Joss brought me here, that I might not see her again. I think that's why I stopped being able to cry around day 4, not because I stopped feeling it. Because crying is for when you still believe somebody's coming to fix it for you, and I'd already stopped believing that by then. I didn't have a wise thing to say to that. I'm not a wise man, whatever the broadsheets made of me afterward. I just told her the truth, which was that grief and readiness aren't opposites, that a person can carry both at once and neither one cancels the other out, and that I'd carried both myself since my wife died and hadn't found them incompatible yet. She thought about that for a long while, the way she thought about everything, and then she said, quietly, that she'd like to keep training, please, if that was all right, and we did, and neither of us mentioned her mother again until the very end. By day 90, I'd stopped thinking of her as Joss wears cargo and started thinking of her as mine to lose. I want to be honest that this terrified me more than the riders did. They came back on day 96, not 3 of them this time, 11, and they didn't bother with the trade inspector story. I saw them at first light, the way Ware had come to me at first light, which felt like something closing a circle I didn't want closed. 11 riders on the eastern road, moving in the kind of formation that isn't subtle once you know to look for it, outriders, a center column, a rear guard watching their own backs as carefully as their front. House Tessely hunters, the real thing this time, come to finish what the cousins had started 96 days before on a porch I still hadn't fully washed clean. I had 2 hands, a cook, a yard built for trade and storage rather than defense, and a child. What I did not have was 4 more days to wait out Ware's deadline. I'm not going to dress up what happened next as some grand battle, because it wasn't one, and the niche this story belongs to isn't built for spectacle, and frankly neither am I. What I'll tell you is what I did, and what she did, because the two of those things together are the whole point of this telling. I drilled an evacuation order into the household over the back half of those 100 days without ever calling it that, because Ware's instinct about quiet had taught me to plan for the loud day without naming it out loud where it might be overheard. Tully knew the watchtower rifles. Ames knew the comm shed. Senna knew the culvert, because Senna was the one who'd sewn the dark traveling clothes in the first place, 3 weeks back, on an evening when neither of us said why out loud and both of us knew exactly why. I sent Tully and Ames to the watchtower with the long rifles, not to fight 11 trained hunters in open ground. We'd lose that fight in under a minute, and I'd told them as much, plainly, more than once during the drilling, but to make the approach slow and costly enough that slow and costly mattered. A formal hunting party riding under a noble house's banner doesn't want a fight that leaves bodies and questions on a compact adjacent border post. They want the quiet disappearance Ware had warned me about from his last breath. Every minute they spent deciding whether my watchtower was worth the noise was a minute bought. I sent Senna Pike to the comm shed to burn every priority channel we had screaming for any compact patrol within range, true or not, because 11 armed riders hesitate at the word patrol even when they don't believe it yet, and hesitation was the only currency I had to spend. And I went to find the girl, because whatever happened next, I wasn't doing it without knowing exactly where she was. I found her already in the equipment shed, already moving, not hiding, moving, pulling on the dark traveling clothes Senna had quietly made for her weeks back against exactly this day, checking the strap on a water skin, the careful, economical motions of someone who has been taught, over 96 days, precisely what to do when the bad thing finally arrives. There was no panic in her hands. I want that understood plainly. Not because she wasn't afraid, I think she was underneath, the way anyone with sense would be, but because fear in her had stopped meaning paralysis sometime around week 70 and started meaning precision instead. "Their house Tessely," she said, "not a question, 11. You counted from the window." I counted from the sound of the hooves before I saw the window. 11 horses, 2 of them carrying double weight, which means gear, not extra riders. They're equipped for a longer stay than a quick grab. They're expecting resistance. She finished the strap, tested its give, adjusted it once more. "There's a culvert under the east fence, the one you never fixed properly. It runs under the perimeter and comes up past the tree line on the ridge. You showed it to me on day 6. You said it was a weak point in our defense." "It is. It's also the only way out of this yard that 11 riders on a formal approach won't think to cover, because formal approaches don't account for the holes nobody bothered fixing. They'll watch the gate. They'll watch the main road. They won't watch a drainage culvert a quartermaster forgot to patch, because nobody plans for the thing that looks like neglect." She looked at me, and there was nothing of the silent, flinching child from that first porch morning left in her face. Not coldness. I want to be clear, never coldness, but a kind of settled, terrible competence that 100 days had built where fear used to live. "I'm not running because I'm scared, Bran. I'm running because the people coming for me want a frightened girl who panics and gets caught in open ground. I'm not going to be that girl. I'm going to be the one who's already gone by the time they finish working out which building I was in." I want to tell you I argued. I didn't. Ware had asked me to keep her alive 100 days, and here, on day 96, was a child who'd spent every one of those days learning exactly how to keep herself alive, and the most useful thing I could do with the time we had left was trust the work. "I'll buy you the gap," I said. "Go." She didn't go, not yet. She caught my sleeve, the same hand that had reached out from under Joss Ware's coat 96 days before, except now it didn't shake. "Come with me," she said. "Not because I can't do this alone, because you taught me I don't have to." That's the line I've turned over in my mind more than any other since in the years after. Not because it was clever, it wasn't. It was just a frightened, brave child telling a hard truth plainly, the way I'd taught her to. But because it was the whole 100 days, distilled down to 9 words. I hadn't trained her into a weapon or a soldier or a legend. I'd trained her into someone who knew, all the way down, that she didn't have to face the bad thing alone, and who'd chosen, even with an escape route memorized and a head start earned, to ask the question rather than simply vanish into the dark on her own. We went through the culvert together, low and quiet cold mud soaking through both our knees, her hand finding the joints in the old pipe ahead of mine because she'd counted them weeks before and remembered the count without needing to think about it. Behind us I heard the first shots from the watchtower, Tully and Ames, exactly on the schedule I'd drilled into them, 2 shots and a fall back, never holding a single position long enough to be flanked. It wasn't a battle. It was theater, careful theater, built to convince 11 professional hunters that a fortified position with armed, coordinated defenders wasn't worth the noise a fast assault would cost them. We came up past the tree line into cold air and pale early light, and I made her stop there, flat against the rock, while I counted the gap between shots from below, checking, the way she'd taught me without meaning to over the last few weeks, that the rhythm down in the yard still matched a controlled retreat and not a position being overrun. It held. Tully's voice carried up once, sharp and clipped, calling a fallback to Ames, and then quiet, and then 2 more shots, evenly spaced, deliberate. Theater bought us the ridge, and the ridge bought us the tree line, and from the tree line we lay flat in the cold grass and watched my yard, 11 years of my life, every fence and shed and storeroom of it, and waited to see whether 11 riders would commit to the noise or decide it wasn't worth the cost. They hesitated. I watched them hesitate, the column slowing at the gate, 2 riders peeling off to scout the perimeter rather than press the assault. And in that hesitation, Senna's screamed priority channel turned out, by more luck than we deserved, to have actually reached a compact border cutter running routine Patrol 2 systems over close enough, with its transponder lit and broadcasting on every frequency we had access to. That House Tessely's hunters broke off rather than be caught mid-act by an actual authority with actual jurisdiction. I watched the formation that had ridden in so carefully 96 minutes before pull back into the kind of disorganized, hurried withdrawal that no formal hunting party ever once witnessed. They didn't get her. They never got close enough to try. She didn't celebrate. I want that understood too. She lay flat in the grass beside me a long moment after the last of the riders had cleared the road, watching the dust settle, and then she let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding for what might have been the better part of an hour, and only then did her shoulders finally come down from where they'd been set since the first hoofbeats reached the window. The 3 days between the riders breaking off and her mother's people finally arriving were the strangest of the whole 100. We didn't go back through the gate that first night. I judged it too soon to trust the withdrawal as final, and instead held the ridge until full dark, then worked our way back down through the tree line to the yard by a route she chose, not me, picking ground that kept us out of sightlines from the road the whole way. Tully and Ames were waiting when we came in, neither of them hurt, both of them quieter than usual, the particular quiet of men who just done something that mattered and weren't yet sure how to talk about it. Senna had food on the table before we'd even gotten the mud off our boots, because some kinds of comfort don't wait for permission either. We kept watch in shifts those 3 days, and the girl took her turn same as the rest of us, same as she'd insisted on doing for weeks by then, and I remember sitting with her on the second night's watch, both of us looking out at a horizon that stayed stubbornly empty, and asking her, finally, the question I'd been carrying since the porch. "Do you regret it?" I said. "Any of it? The 100 days, all of it being like this instead of soft?" She thought about it the way she thought about everything, turning it over fully before answering. "Joss wanted me soft," she said. "Hidden and soft and waiting to be handed back whole, like cargo nobody damaged in transit. I think that's what scared him most at the end, that he couldn't give me soft, only you, and you weren't going to give me soft either." She looked at me. "I don't regret it. I think soft would have gotten me killed. I think you gave me the only thing that was actually going to keep me alive, which was the truth that nobody was coming to make the world safe for me, so I had to become someone the world couldn't easily unmake instead." A pause. "That's not a complaint, Bran. That's a thank you. I don't think I know how to say thank you any other way yet." "You just said it fine," I told her, and that was the whole of that conversation, and it was enough. Her mother's people arrived on day 99. A full warship's worth of escort this time, no half measures left in them after losing one set of guardians already. I watched from the ridge as the formal envoy walked up to my battered yard with all the ceremony due a returned heir, and I watched the girl walk down to meet them, not running to them with relief, the way you might expect a rescued child to run, but walking, measured, watching the angle of every stranger's shoulders the way I'd taught her, even with her own people, even now. The envoy's captain, a tall, severe woman in the deep blue of the Royal Household Guard, dropped to one knee in front of the girl the moment she was close enough, and I watched the girl receive that gesture with a stillness that wasn't coldness, simply the same careful weighing she gave everything now, royal protocol included. Before she boarded the transport that would take her home to a life I'd never see and a title I'd never use, she turned back to me one last time. 100 days, she said. Joss called it a wall, you never called it that. What did I call it? You never called it anything. You just did it every day like it was just the next thing in front of you. She looked at me a long moment, the same flat, careful look from the porch, except it didn't mean watching a door anymore. It meant something else entirely. That's what I'm taking with me. Not the fence checking or the card tricks, just that. doing the next right thing in front of you every day, whether anybody's watching or not. I never heard a formal accounting of what she became afterward. Not officially, not from any channel that bothered informing a border post quartermaster of where a returned heir's life went next. But word travels on the trade lanes the way it always has, garbled and half-true and growing in the telling. And what reached me over the following seasons was this: that House Tessely's cousins found themselves, within a year, with considerably less appetite for contested succession than they'd started with, because the girl they'd hunted as an easy target had come home neither broken nor vengeful but unshakable, calm in rooms that made grown diplomats flinch, reading every false courtesy for exactly what it was, building person by person, the kind of quiet loyalty that doesn't bend because somebody applies pressure to it. Not a weapon, never a weapon. Something the galaxy, by all the accounts that reached me, found a great deal harder to account for than a weapon would have been. I still run the yard at Harrow's Stake. I still check the fence line every morning, the same eastern stretch I never quite finished fixing, though I patched the culvert years back, mostly out of habit, mostly because some doors you close once you know exactly what walked through them. Tully still beats nobody at cards. Senna still sets an extra plate some mornings, out of habit too, before she remembers, and there's nothing sad in that anymore, just a small steady warmth where the empty space used to be. A letter reached me once 2 years on, unsigned but in a hand I recognized, short, careful sentences, the same economy she'd carried out of my yard. It didn't say much. It said the fence-checking habit had followed her, that she still counted footsteps and read shoulders in rooms full of people who'd never once had to learn either, and that it made the diplomats around her uncomfortable in ways she found, in her words, more useful than not. It said she hoped Tully had finally learned not to lead with his weakest card. It said thank you, plainly, the way she'd told me once she didn't know how to say it any other way, and it didn't need to say more than that, because by then I understood the shape of her well enough to hear everything folded into those few lines that she hadn't spelled out directly. I buried Joss where behind the equipment shed 100 days before a child walked out of my yard into a life bigger than anything either of us could have given her. I think about him sometimes, dying on my porch with his one clear instruction: keep her alive 100 days, and I think the thing he never got to see, the thing that would have surprised even him, is that I never once raised her to survive 100 days. I raised her to survive all the days after. That's the whole of it, not a fairy story, just 100 days and the next right thing every morning whether anybody was watching or not.